Welcome to Oral Roberts University and to our conversation on pastoral burnout. I'm Bill Bucher, the Associate Dean of the College of Theology and Ministry, and I'm joined today by four of my colleagues, Dr. Jeff Voth, Dr. Clarence Boyd, Professor Kerry Loescher, Dr. John Thompson, all of whom have had pastoral ministry, some still very much lead pastors in their churches, talking about something dear to our hearts, the challenges of pastoral ministry. Today's pastor faces challenges that haven't been faced ever before and are trying to negotiate how to stay in the ministry and thrive in the ministry. And we know one of the biggest challenges is the expectations that are put on the pastor, as well as the expectations the pastor has of himself or herself about what it means to be successful in ministry. Sometimes those expectations clash. The pastor experiences stress, which is one of the biggest reasons why pastors consider quitting. It's just the level of stress. Tell me a little bit about your experience. How do you manage those expectations? I mean, I joke with my students sometimes that it would take a burning bush experience to get me to pastor again, and I'm staying away from bushes. But tell me about your experience in terms of managing those expectations from the congregation, your family, yourself. How do you do it?
So I've been in ministry, I can't believe this, 40 years. And about halfway in, I stopped trying to compare myself with others and realized that God made me to be myself, and there was no one better at being me than me. So I'm not comparing in the way I preach with someone else. That was helpful.
It's one of the classic characteristics of a performance mindset. I'm going to compare, I compete, criticize,
Yeah.
Sure.
You know, one of the things that's critically important, the average church is about 200 members. And one of the things you talk about comparing yourself, your members compare your church to other churches.
Oh, man.
And of course, that's a reality and a challenge because they're looking at entertainment, they're looking at expenses, buildings, and we're looking at discipleship and evangelism. And of course, one thing that we must be aware of is the fact that who we're going to reach is in our community, not necessarily in a megachurch.
That's good.
Yeah, it is.
There's also a comparison with where I want to be. I see myself achieving that, so I'm driven to get there. Instead of just relaxing and letting God do what He wants to do in this season, in this moment, I think for much of my ministry, I was always focused on next year or 5 years from now, instead of right here in this moment, what does God want to do?
I think it's also a piece, though, where, like, for me, I'm a planner. And so I start thinking about if I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this, we should have these kinds of results. And it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it's a little more of a salsa dance as opposed to a straight line. And I had to learn a lot about what does it mean to figure out what today's work is and to today's work today. And if I spend today worrying about tomorrow and the next day and the next day after that, the anxiety of that steals the joy even of what today's work is. And I'm still learning.
I mean, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking, what does success look? How do I know when I get there?
Yeah.
Is it a great sermon? Is it the altar call? A bunch of people come? How do I know when I'm being successful? Yeah.
Especially when you think about, here's my job description, here's what people are maybe expecting, and maybe not very clearly, but they've got some sort of agenda with it, and that these two things don't match a lot of times. And then sometimes what's on the paper is insufficient because what we're doing is we're building a plane while we're flying a plane at the same time. And so how do we adapt?
And then what's God expect?
Yeah.
Is he pleased with what I'm doing? And how would I know? I know. I think I'm a lot better now. I was a performance addict. I mean, I was addicted to, I did this, I shared my faith, I preached a great sermon, and there were a lot of people here Sunday. I think I got addicted to that.
Sure.
And that's not healthy.
Yeah, one of the things I think is important is what are we measuring?
Yeah.
A lot of times we measure numbers, we measure finances, but there was a season when I was pastoring where we decided, let's not talk about how many people were there on Sunday. Because Monday, the conversation was always, how did Sundays go? And it was, the response was always how many people
How many
came.
people, what tithe and offering,
Right.
how much, yeah.
And when we stopped
Yeah.
talking about that, then we were able to really see what God was actually doing when we were together.
I started telling the people that would come to me with those numbers, stop telling me. I don't want to know, because I am a performance addict.
I was socialized into that mindset from day one in our culture, that we think in terms of our value and worth is based on our performance. And so we're often running, and we bring that same mindset into the church, and we tend to judge success based on performance, which then lends itself to that drivenness you're talking about. It's like I have to keep outdoing myself. That was a good sermon, but next one even better than the last one, and even better. After a while, the stress builds because you can only outdo yourself for so long.
So learning to ask the question, what am I supposed to do? I mean, what does God have for me to do at this place? In my own walk with him, that's a powerful understanding to learn what it is I'm supposed to do for him, and then within the context of the church I'm in, regardless of the size.
I think one of the things that's real, you cannot compete with the competition. You're called to do what you're called to do. And part of that challenge is, from this perspective, is that you have to help members understand biblical principles. They want to talk about comparing to a big church, etc. They got to understand that's another man's calling, that's another man's vision. This is our call, this is our vision. How do we prepare to fulfill the vision that we're called to? And again, I go back to, listen, this is a community. You're not going to touch another man's community. You're called to touch the community you're in. And we've got to learn how to be prepared and humble before God and keep our eyes on what our calling is and not comparing ourselves to somebody else.
Okay, so let's complicate it just for a second. Because when you think about it, I mean, you're called to this work to pastor in the local church, but I'm also called to pastor in my own home, and I'm also called to care for my neighbors. And so these are all different and sometimes distinct things. And so how do you do that and not lose your mind or lose your family or lose your job, in the whole process?
Well, that's part of the challenge that you have with being in the pastorate. You have to understand your call by priorities. My family is the first priority.
Okay,
My
but always
calling.
every time?
Well, there are challenges with that. Let's be real.
Okay.
Let's be real with that.
Yeah.
But you have to know what your challenges are. And you have to know what's valuable to you and what is not going to be sacrificed.
Yeah.
In other words, I'm not going to pastor at the expense of my house, my family, my relationship, my children. But at the same time, I understand that I have a calling there. I have a calling here in different places. And one of the things pastors can do to help with stress is make sure that the members understand that. We have a calling that's our call.
Yeah.
And that is stressful enough, okay? But when we complicate that by trying to compare and compete, then we have other issues that complicate our lives and our ministry.
And let me suggest that our call starts with if you're married and have a family, starts at home. And I remember years ago, my wife and I looked at one another. We had 4 kids, and we're like, it is our priority to, number one, engage in our marriage and then impart to our kids. And so we're not going to miss our kids' stuff. And at that point, we were at one of the fastest growing churches in the country as youth pastors. But wouldn't it be sinful if one of my kids missed heaven because I was spending so much time with other people's children?
Yeah.
We had to make that
Oh,
value
man.
call. Yeah.
Well, and just thinking about how do you explain to people, if I take better care of somebody else's kids and somebody
Come on.
else's marriage than I do my own marriage or my own kids, to stand in front of Jesus someday and to explain that I lost my family, but in pursuit of your family, how do we do that?
Yeah, well, that's the bottom line. So what am I supposed to do? What am I called to do? In terms of me, not in terms of what everybody else may want or what everybody else is doing. Well, let's pick up there in a minute.